Hello, my name is Kevin Berry, and today I'll be presenting a roadmap for building a commercial space ecosystem. This paper is about infrastructure and opening up opportunities for development in space and economic expansion from the reduction in transaction costs and opportunities that infrastructure provides, drawing from the lessons of history and projects on Earth to turn the lofty dreams of space into an action plan for development. Infrastructure is like building a raised bed garden. Neither of them is intended as the end product, but to facilitate building fertile ground for the development further on. Using this metaphor, physical infrastructure is defined by the walls and lattices of a garden to protect and support rapid growth in the environment. Legal infrastructure is the planting guide to say how far apart to place the plants and how to weed and keep out weeds in the garden. Financial infrastructure is represented by the water and nutrients, providing a continuous stream of support and investment in further growth in the garden. To qualify these three aspects of infrastructure, the three metrics of effectiveness, standardization, capacity building, and sustainability, are used to assess the maturity of the system. Standardization is represented by the reliability and economic integration and represents the ability for a system to utilize economies of scale to solve issues. Capacity building is the amount of throughput the system has in the number of simultaneous transactions that can be processed, and also represents the resilience of the system to rapid growth or unexpected problems. And finally, sustainability is about being able to utilize common public resources to achieve these goals without damaging the environment, and to be able to persist through changing market conditions without external stimulus to continue the plan. Together, these 6 categories form this 3x3 grid, along with a preview of the 9 historical case studies that will be reviewed. Each sector, I will first go over the historical case study and then compare it to its space analog, following this mini grid shown here in the top left. And then I will conclude with a roadmap for development based on these observations. As you can see, shipping containers represent physical standardization on the mini grid. Shipping containers have had a larger economic impact than free trade did during World War II. This is because shipping containers, developed by Malcolm McLean in 1956, provided a door-to-door option that allowed transfer between trucks, ships, and trains interchangeably. This massive increase in productivity was about 40 times what longshore gangs had been able to load and unload ships with for hundreds and thousands of years. Immediately upon its introduction into Europe, there was a decline in insurance, shipping time, transport costs, demand on the ports, and as a result, it was almost globally adopted by 1990. CubeSats represent the standardization already taking place in space. The 10 centimeter cube of a 1U CubeSat is allowing many new actors, from universities to small businesses, to get their satellites into space when sharing large rocket fairings headed up. This increase in the number of objects in space is not without cost, however. Large constellations, as shown in a NASA study in 2018, require a massive increase in reliability in order to operate safely. According to that study, more than 99% post-mission disposal will be needed to maintain comparable rates of risk. The Panama Canal was a monumental achievement that was completed in 1914, just months before the beginning of World War I. It is a prime example of how massive infrastructure is built, what it can do, and what efforts are necessary in order to bring it about. In order to make the Panama Canal a reality, it went through 4 distinct phases, and in the American phase, It required the building of a railroad and an entire city just to support the construction of the canal. In the end, the canal reduced the travel time from New York to California by over 8,000 miles and has served as a massive geopolitical boon to trade ever since its completion. A space elevator, like the one hypothesized on the right here, would lift 170,000 metric tons to orbit annually, and departure from its apex anchor would have enough kinetic energy to travel anywhere in the solar system, including to Mars, in as little as 67 days. This project would require a massive amount of logistics and international support in order to construct, but once done would really increase the capacity for humanity to move into the orbital environment and out among the planets. In contrast to the Panama Canal, a not-so-planned or coordinated development was that of the California gold rush in the 1800s. During that time, these unsustainable practices released more than 10 million pounds of mercury into the Sierra Nevada mountains, and it's still a health risk in California today because of the effects of bioaccumulation and not breaking down in the environment. This huge environmental damage is very expensive to fix, and is represented by this pyramid of preservation on the right-hand side, shows that remediation is the most expensive and difficult step in preserving the environment, but with better established normative behaviors and mitigation, you can reduce or eliminate the need for remediation entirely, and thus it is by far the most economically efficient solution. Despite the international targets we have in place for mitigation of 90% post-mission disposal, on a per-mass basis, in low Earth orbit, only 25% of non-naturally compliant satellites even attempted to comply with these guidelines, and only 5 to 15% in the last decade were successful in their attempt. While the collision risk in orbit is still very low, the risk is exponentially rising and already beginning to cause significant launch delays from overlapping exclusion windows. And as mentioned before, in order to handle large satellites, we will need to increase from 90 to 99% in order to ensure continuous, safe operating conditions. The Bundle of Rights standardizes legal market transactions in the United States in its regulation and breakup of all the various aspects that a property owner can have. This allows complicated market transactions from leasing land, using it as collateral, selling individual rights like water rights, or allowing permitted uses on the land, as the U.S. Forest Service does when managing the commons of the United States forests, when they can lease out land to miners or lumberjacks to go in and harvest materials from the commons and then return them to a good state based on their lease agreements. This marketplace of understanding and value and being able to trade these commodities is fundamental to how the private sector operates in the United States. And by comparison, the Outer Space Treaty defines all of space as a global commons, and there's still significant debate over property rights and what individual and national actors are permitted and not permitted to do in space. The Artemis Accords have the aim of clarifying some of these questions, but are still voluntary guidelines set by US policy and lack international support and consensus. In order to build a commercial space sector that is thriving and well understood, we will need to have more international consensus, and the Bundle of Rights, as demonstrated here, can help to guide what those rights may be and how they could be allocated and valued. The North American Free Trade Agreement was a treaty between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and it worked to clarify the definitions of professional services, manage trade disagreements, and serve as a place of arbitration for disagreements between the three countries. Harmonizing these legal systems is complicated, but it was critical for markets to develop the capacity to handle the enhanced regulation because, in effect, it increased trade and relations between all three countries, and they were all better as a result. It had a strong impact on the future of trade agreements as well. In space, we're already seeing that the capacity is being overwhelmed, as there has been a 630% increase in the number of launches over the last 10-year average just in the last few years. These new constellations are projected to have upwards of 500,000 self-conjunctions, which need to be reported by these agencies, but only will realize a collision rate of 2 to 3 collisions a year. The number of false positives in this is very unsustainable, and we need to develop better systems to handle the enhanced regulations and laws as they are developed. In particular, Space Policy Directive Number 4 also established the Space Force as a way of managing the military aspects in space, and Space Policy Directive 3 has consolidated many of their responsibilities to the Department of Commerce. Moving forward, we will need to make sure that these organizations are given the requisite funding to achieve their given tasks. The Montreal Protocol is the best international environmental treaty to date. It has 100% of the UN signatories as ratifying and agreeing to the solution, and it has, in effect, reduced 99% of all of the ozone-damaging pollutants since its signing in 1987. This protocol was so successful because it was based on a flexible development agreed upon by small consensus of experts who were committed, and the formation of committees with economic and technical advisors to advise the best solutions to have the least impact on industry moving forward. This non-punitive system really focused on achieving maximum adherence to the agreed upon goals to freeze, reduce, and eliminate all sources of pollution. And it had a fund dedicated to making sure that any country not in compliance with it was brought up to standard. Comparatively, the UN Long-Term Sustainability Guidelines are also working to build a UN coalition, currently at 92 countries, based on a voluntary, non-binding space policy to preserve the orbital environment for all. But because of its non-binding nature, these are more aspirational goals that are left to individual countries to decide how much and to what degree they're being complied with. Further work to develop more consensus among the international community will be instrumental in moving forward by not trying to ask so many groups to agree on something not fully understood yet. The UN Long-Term Sustainability Guidelines are guidelines for future work in this area. Homeowners associations do an excellent job of reframing the commons as a privilege and not as a public right. Elinor Ostrom analyzed the usage of commons and found that in many ways the 8 design principles for preserving the commons can be exemplified in this HOA model. HOAs are very good at serving their specific communities, and they're specific to that group. For example, low-income senior housing in the suburbs versus a trendy urban community with high-dollar amenities is going to have very different needs, funding, and amenity requirements. And the stream of payments that an HOA creates, like a tax on their residents, can be used to solve these issues and provide services. All told, this does a lot of work to mitigate the risk of large projects, and it allows more assured financial liquidity and investment moving forward. In space, this can be applied to the fact that at 400 kilometers, the needs are very different than what we observe in GEO, and therefore it would be helpful to sort these orbital layers based on the different stakeholder groups represented in them, such that the funding they spend doesn't go towards something that doesn't benefit them directly, but rather funding serves the groups most directly affected by their investment. And focusing on their niche, they can have greater representation and have stronger social contracts to enforce those agreements already settled upon, as was demonstrated so well in the Montreal Protocol. In order to fund these investments, it is important to look at recent infrastructure investment terrestrially. In 2013, global infrastructure investment was over $3.3 trillion, but only 1% of it came from institutional capital, despite its reserves of over $200 trillion in assets. This is not because it is unprofitable necessarily. Infrastructure has a 12 to 17% return and 2 to 6% more in emerging markets. Furthermore, the default risk rate for infrastructure investments in Africa is only 3%, less than Europe and less than half of what is observed in the United States. By mitigating these risks, intermediary funds using institutional investment can serve to reduce the risk-adjusted return to make them attractive to institutional investment and mobilize those markets into the sector. In practice, blended finance has an observed leverage ratio of about 4 to 1, meaning that for every dollar invested, you get $4 of functional investment in the sector you are investing. And the indirect investment, if you include all of the secondary industries that are spawned in order to facilitate that development, can be as high as 10 to 50 times as high. In China, their solar project leveraged blended finance, and they found that they got 50 times their original investment for the production of rooftop solar, largely because it was a good product that was seen as too high risk to be worth investing in. But once it was demonstrated, proved to be a very lucrative investment for all parties involved. Space is also receiving a huge amount of investment. In 2019, venture capital represented $4 billion in the space startup investment, about 1/7 of the entire venture capital market in the US, and 71% of the investment in space startups. This investment has been exponentially increasing over the last decade and is continuing to rise. If only 5% of this venture capital financing were paired with blended finance, it could facilitate up to double the effective investment in space, or in any of the sustainability measured thus far. The Transcontinental Railroad was another monumental achievement that was completed 7 years ahead of schedule, under budget, and within 10 years it had already facilitated $50 million of annual traffic. This was paid for by the US government and by private finance, which bankrolled the project on the inherent value provided in the land grants from the United States to Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads, where they competed to receive 12,800 acres or 20 square miles of land, including all of the mining rights for each mile of rail they built headed towards the center. This facilitated the development of dozens of mines, towns, and some of which even grew into major cities. And today, the US rail network is over 140,000 miles, the largest in the world, and it employs more than 221,000 people. But it was even more effective for the financial community and the banks which invested in all of these various towns, and for the US economy, because the government benefited far more than its initial investment based on the increase in wealth in the country. When trying to build something as speculative as the cislunar economy, many of these lessons can be applied, including exclusive use and land right grants given not necessarily by a government, but by some entity to secure long-term investment reliability in the future and provide an inherent anchor value to keep the speculative project from wildly fluctuating in an unconfirmed market. In conclusion, based on the 9 case studies reviewed, the best practices are shown below, highlighted based on the categories on the left here. In order to make sense of these 9, I have sorted it in 3 sections. The first here, shown in green, are the low-hanging fruit. Increasing the reliability and standardization of satellites, combined with building up the pyramid of preservation, will go a long way to preserving and maintaining a safe orbital environment for the utilization of all. And that by utilizing blended finance, these extra expenditures can be added in without significantly impacting the bottom line of either the companies or the governments involved in this extra sustainable effort. The next steps, highlighted in blue, are more involved than the first 3, but they're still doable and achievable goals. Scaling the bureaucratic and regulatory groups will be necessary to functionally manage the increase in space activity, and especially with increasing space regulations. By leveraging enhanced social obligation, we can mitigate these costs by letting space actors work together and focus on peer-to-peer relationships rather than a hierarchical structure based on managing all of space. By motivating development with competition and tying these resources up with inherent value, we can facilitate the most economically efficient development of large space projects necessary for moving forward in the orbital environment and on the moon. The most difficult long-term goals are shown here in purple. They likely represent the final pieces of the puzzle for the commercialization of space and will require the most time and investment from the international community to complete. Investment in the construction of the space elevator will be transformative with humanity's relationship to space, and providing clarity on the property rights and the utilization of space resources, combined with the development of flexible and binding international arrangements, will mean more security for all actors wishing to have activities in outer space and make investments to its further development. Conferences such as Ascend and IAC are critical to achieving all 9 of these goals because they bring together space sector actors on neutral ground as a way to promote standardization and continuing innovation in all of these categories. Governments can also take some of these actions now in order to improve safety of the space sector rather than focusing on the shortfalls of their foreign neighbors. Forming associations will serve as a key tool for pushing and developing shared values about these negative externalities and how the international community wishes to mitigate them, create common space law, and eventually build major space physical infrastructure. The price of getting to space continues to drop, and it's becoming very fertile ground for commercial and economic development. Whether the sector grows weeds or roses, and whether our seedlings grow or wither will depend on the infrastructure that is developed now while our garden is young. Let's see a flourishing space garden in the future for the benefit of all humankind. Thank you.